about my exhibition, This Is Not the End, and Erin's perfectly suited to talk with us about this show because she was so instrumental in the beginning of this work. I had quit making landscape paintings for the time, and she was over at my house during a break. This was during her PhD work. She has a PhD in aesthetics from the University of Texas in Dallas, and she was on a fall break or some sort of break from her studies, and she was at my house, and I was showing her my new work. I was making mixed media pieces where I was collaging fabrics onto wooden panels. And Erin, you were the one that helped me realize how connected that work was to my daily life.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that work, actually.
Let's do it. We're going to talk about that work.
Because after seeing it, we were looking at all of the pieces, and you were repeating so many ideas and repeating so many materials that I was thinking at the time a lot about repetition because of the work that I was doing and the idea of making place through repetition. And so Michelle's work was really, it made sense to me when I saw it. But I'd love to hear more about that. Like, tell us about this idea of repetition and liturgy, which was really taken up in your first body of work that got you to this work that you're doing now.
Yeah, and there's definitely elements of this work, of that work here. I have one of those pieces here in this show. But I was gluing down these pieces of cloth, and I was also just in my own actions of my own process of making. I was even painting over patterns in the fabric and redrawing them. I was hammering little tiny nails around the edges of things as borders. And Erin pointed out, and she had heard me talk many times just about my life with small children, and she said, you know, you have so much repetition in your life. You've got dishes every day, meals, and I was changing diapers and feeding children, and there was just the getting up in the morning and then the getting people to sleep at night. And Erin really helped me make that connection of the textile processes of women's craft, or even weaving fabric in order to clothe a family. Those are life-giving repetitions, and they are a perfect metaphor for the kind of life that you're living, where you repeat things over and over and it makes something. You even talked a little bit about Shakespeare, one of the phrases.
Yeah, the way he uses language, he repeats himself over and over again. I think in a sort of meditative way, I mean, that's sort of how it strikes me, is that repetition and iteration is meditative, liturgical. That's sort of like a trendy idea right now. This was kind of before all that was trendy.
Before it was trendy, we were talking about this. Before the books came out.
Exactly. It's funny because the way I was thinking about it at the time was industrial. I was taking a class on progressivism at the turn of the 20th century, and we were talking about Ford's plant, and we were talking about efficiency and industrial efficiency and the car manufacturing, and going from handmade textiles to machine-made textiles, and I was looking at photographs of that. And all of that was going through my mind of how do we take, like if my job is a job where I have to be at a textile machine, or if I have to be on a line somewhere, how does that work become restorative and meditative in the same way that somebody who maybe has work like being a mother, where it's the same sort of repetition, but it doesn't feel like it's producing human product, right? Does that make sense? Like in motherhood, you are working towards relationships with people. A person who works on a production line doesn't necessarily feel that way. And I was reading all of this stuff by women at the turn of the 20th century who were talking about women particularly going into industry and how this was changing their lives and changing their bodies. And I was really taken with this idea of how does industrial repetition become meditative? And how is that sort of a picture of liturgy? And then your work was definitely not industrial, but you were also using industrial materials, which is what you're doing in this show as well. So one of the things that Michelle and I have talked about in this show is that she's using both handmade objects that were made from generations past, as well as she's using machine-made objects, material culture, so 2 different kinds of material culture. And right now I'm looking across the way and I see clothing, and I know this clothing is like from Costco or Walmart or a thrift store, right?
Yeah.
And it is likely, it's not handmade, it's machine-made material. So I'm curious, and it's obviously made on a textile mill, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then how does that, you combining these both handmade objects as well as these industrial made objects, and then reworking them, what's going on there in the product, or the, I use the word product and I hate the word product, but that's kind of what
What's
you're
produced,
doing.
right?
You're producing a product, but you're producing a product that's a little, it's more caring than an industrial product, right? So talk about that a little bit.
Ooh, now she's bringing up new thoughts for me. I do think often about the fact that at this point in my making, I'm not interested I'm interested in everything that comes out of my studio or out of my, production being handmade and being touched by me. It is possible, we have so much democratization now in just for makers that I could choose to have some of my products remade by a small factory, essentially, right? I can hire robots I can buy the robots, right?
Yes.
I can put them in my house, I can have a robot make my work for me. But and at this point, that's not the kind of thing I want to speak about. So with my work, I want people to have some object. If they want an object from me, I want it to be something that they know I've spent time on. Not just because of some sort of snobbery, but a robot can't make the same kind of thing, right? And it's not invested in the same kind of repetition. So, I don't know, I'm not particularly articulate about that, but I'm more interested in some handmade object that is maybe pulling all these wild things out of the material culture soup and trying to get back to that kind of slow, human-paced beauty.
Yeah.
Right now, minimalism is still, pretty well grounded into to the way that our lives look.
Right.
And I do want to speak about those really time-intensive materials that we still can find, but aren't necessarily honored.
You brought up minimalism, which I hadn't thought about, but we've had conversations before about minimalism, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Like, is your work, do you relate it to minimalism, or do you relate it to some sort of maximalism, or
that?
Yeah.
Well, one thing, and I'm not against minimalism. I do want to. I remember I had a professor in grad school say, can your work pass that 30-second test? Do people want to even stop and look at it for very long? And I believe that if people are going to invest in artwork, I'd love for them to have things that they could continually discover.
Yeah.
Things that that would continue to give back to them over time. So I, as a maker, as an artist, have to infuse the work with that kind of care, with delight, with discovery, if I want them to be able to, and I'm not saying that all work has to take a long time, but I do think that the work that I'm drawn to personally as an observer and as an artist, I'm drawn to work that has a lot going on. And I know that's not for everybody, but that's what my work is.
Yeah, so. Well, it awakens curiosity, right? Mm-hmm. Whenever there's a piece that's kind of behind me back here that when I came to see the show, it made me cry. I stood in front of it and I cried, and I stood there and I was thinking, why is this piece moving me so much today? And it's not a minimalistic piece, it's a very maximalistic piece.
Yes.
It's a box that looks like a house that's full of things. It's crammed full of things. And things that are familiar and things that are unfamiliar. I mean, some of them are little tableau dollhouse things that feel like places that I know. Others are more out of scale and they don't feel that way. But my reaction to it was, there's so much to look at, right? A, and B, that's how my life feels. That there are too many things I have to focus on and nothing can disappear. And that, I think, is kind of what you're going for, right? That sense that that's what our lives look like, is that there are so many things we have to focus on, and then there are so many things in that awaken curiosity. I mean, what is more beautiful than a diorama? I don't know. I think they're weird.
We haven't found it yet.
I just love that idea of like so many things to awaken my knowing and to feel like new worlds are being created in tiny little spaces. One of my most formative memories, maybe you don't want to hear this, but you do.
I've heard it before. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I like it.
One of my most formative memories, years ago, I took a quiz. Before I went to grad school, I took a quiz that the choreographer, dancer, Twyla Tharp has in her book, The Creative Habit, which I'm recommending that book to everyone. I have grad students that read that book, and she has this series of questions that are your creative autobiography. And I don't think I've ever encountered anything that helped me reflect at that point in my career that I needed more than I needed it then, because I was looking for a new direction. And one of the questions she asks is, what are your most formative creative memories? I should ask you that question.
Okay,
Think about it.
that's
Think about
fine.
it. So my most formative creative memory is something that Michelle's work really taps into. I always tell my students there are sometimes whenever we're working on something creative, we think it's beautiful, we think it's wonderful because we have some memory that we haven't yet remembered, right? We have some sort of elemental memory that we haven't yet remembered. Anyway, she asked that question and my answer was making small worlds in pie pans. My grandmother would give us pie pans, little aluminum or steel pie pans. She had stacks of them, right? Because she would make pies and freeze them. And she would send us out into the yard with these pie tins, which feels like your work in a nutshell. I love it. And she would say, go find stuff and build a world. And my cousins and my brother don't remember this experience at all, but I remember it so vividly because I remember thinking, I can make whatever I want. Nobody can tell me how to make the world that I can make. And so we would gather moss and rocks and sticks and anything we could find in the house or in the trash, because they had a big piece of property, and we would build little worlds. And that formative memory, I think, is coming into focus when I see this work behind me, that I say, oh yes, I remember doing that. Like that formed me as a person. So I guess my question for you is, what is your most formative creative memory? Do you remember?
I do make dioramas. And I'm not just saying that. I did. Before I go into that though, I want to say I had at least 3 parents come to this show and tell me that their children make dioramas, and they told, and one sent me photos.
How wonderful!
And so someday I really do want to curate a show of both adult and child dioramas, because I think they're just so essential.
They are.
So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And there are some diorama pieces that I've got here. I remember taking a shoebox and making a diorama of my dad's study.
Nice.
And I do remember that I used a toothpaste cap, because we had this like accordion fold look plastic trash can. So it almost looked like the upside down of one of those lampshades.
Yeah.
But I found a toothpaste cap that has the pretty stuff, so I remember doing that. But I would make these dioramas, so I do remember that. As far as another visual memory, I remember I had a shirt that had, I thought, the best color combination in the world. So that was definitely the color. And I remember making a quilt. I still have it. It's probably this big. And it's a crazy quilt. I had no clue what I was doing, but I do remember making a quilt. It's not quilted. I have safety pins in it.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I guess you could say it's like tie quilted.
Yeah.
But I made a quilt. So I do remember those crafts, and I will never get away from craft. Like craft to me is just that's just part of who I am, and I won't stop.
Yeah.
So
okay, so next question that makes me think of the idea of fine art. So we've had this conversation before about the work that you do, its relationship to fine art, and sort of the elitism, can I use that word? The elitism and this sort of in crowd of fine art that leaves out this area of craft that you love so much.
Yeah.
And the area of textiles, which is so left out of the idea of fine art.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm curious, what's the conversation you're having about that? Because you certainly are having a conversation when you make oil paintings on industrial pie tins, right? Domestic muffin tins feel like the antithesis of fine art, but you're taking those canvases, if you will, and you're creating oil paintings on those canvases, which my mother used to do whenever I was young. I remember her doing that. Like, it was a very crafty thing to do. So talk to us about that, the relationship of fine art to the craft work that you're doing.
Yeah. I think one of the first things I thought of when I started painting on the pans are those huge, okay, so I've lived in South Carolina my whole life, close to the mountains of North Carolina, those big saw blades, and they would do scenes on them.
Yes.
And then also the long
saws.
what is this kind of saw? Yeah, like this kind.
Yeah.
Maybe my husband knows what they're called, but the kind that you have to do this to cut down a tree.
We would
and
just
they
call
would
them saw.
saw, yeah, and saber tooth maybe. So there would be paintings on those. You'd see them places, and I've never been drawn to those personally, but I also don't have a connection with lumberjacks, you know.
Right.
So when I started painting on those pans, I just honestly I can't even remember what made me do it at the beginning. But I did it, and I felt a little like, this could be really good or really bad.
Right.
But on the other hand, I'm just kind of like, I don't care anymore. Like, I'm making my art.
Try it, yeah.
But I also there's enough subversion in me that I'm like, nobody can take a photograph of this and print a bunch out. Like, you have to have the real one.
Yeah, you
or
can't
you don't
just
get
use
it.
it.
You know?
Yeah.
But I also don't price those ones very high because I just feel like I want people to be able to have those ones. You know what I mean? And they also, like these pieces that are mixed media take a long time just to construct them. So that's my level of democratization with that. I keep the price on those ones low, but I also, I love one thing I'm thinking about the whole time, which I guess it's better to think about the object itself, but I try to get that patina, whether it's a shiny finish or whether I love when I can find the ones that are kind of rusty, but I try to get that to actually be part of the image itself.
Yeah.
So I'm not just slapping an image on something, it's interacting with the pan itself.
Right. Well, what's interesting about fine art is it feels so inaccessible in some ways. It's like far away, right? It's in the distance. And what you're, in the sense that the objects of fine art are oftentimes not usable. There's no usable quality to them. Something that I think is interesting that you're doing is you're creating objects, so like a quilt, which people use every day. You're creating paintings on pie pans, which pie pans are used every day. You paint on a canvas that you then smock, which little girls in the South wear smocked, and boys wear smocked clothes every day. There seems to be something you're doing there where you're taking a form that is highly practical and common and everyday and ordinary, and you're creating fine art out of it with the idea that you might hang this on the wall, but when you see it, you're also going to be reminded of an ordinary everyday object. Is that a good?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
My husband reminded me, there's a piece behind us, it's a large piece that is a landscape, and then I painted a doily over that said bread. And he reminded me that when I did that, I said, everyone's gonna want this landscape, but I'm gonna paint a doily over it, and they'll have to have the doily with it.
Well, I remember when you were working on it, because we were looking
destroying
at it, and
it.
you were like, I'm creating this beautiful landscape that everybody's gonna wanna buy, and I'm gonna mess it up.
So, but I think that I want the particular, right? And it may be something that you enjoy looking at, and it may not be. And like I think it's a lecture that Seth Godin gives. Like he says, the first thing an artist has to be able to say is, "Look, I made this," and the second thing the artist has to say is, "It may not be for you."
Yeah.
And so, because I feel like I feel very strongly about there's work that I am supposed to make. You know, like you get to a point where you probably, I'm sure you're this way. Erin can do like a number of roles. You know,
Sure.
You can act a huge range of roles, but there's certain roles that are for you.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, especially when you're teaching, like you do end up building out this skill set that's pretty wide.
Yeah.
Because you have to teach so much diverse kind of stuff.
Right.
But there is also work that's very specific to why I'm here on Earth, right? So I'm
Yes.
not here to just make whatever you want me to make. I'm
Right.
here to make this thing that I think speaks to a need. And I was a little bit concerned with this show that it just wouldn't resonate. Like, will this only resonate with a handful of moms, right?
Right.
But there were a number of people that came through last weekend and said, I didn't really expect this work to resonate, but it actually brought up some memories.
Yeah.
And even sometimes some things I need to deal with.
Right.
Even, you know? And so I feel like that, we may not all be moms, we may not all want doilies in our house,
Right.
but we've all had a grandmother or a mom or someone in our life that was that kind of person to
Right.
us. And so I feel like in that way, it might have a wider audience than I expected.
Right. You know, what struck me about the piece, the landscape piece with the big doily painted over it, has always struck me about that is the sort of anti-art movement, right? Where you take something that's sort of beautiful in our reaction to it or response to it, and then you destroy it in some way, right? Like you do a little destruction chaos.
Yeah.
And you did the opposite. Like you took something that is sort of standard commercialized.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can go to World Market today, or you can go to Hobby Lobby, or you can go to Walmart for that matter, and you can buy a landscape in a pretty combination of colors.
That will not offend you.
That will not offend you. And it can even be in a combination of colors that is suited to your home, right? It's very decorative, it matches your furniture, and you choose it because it matches your furniture, even though it really has nothing to do with anything. And you took that idea, and instead of ripping the canvas or being cruel to the canvas or making an anti-art statement, you made a different kind of a statement, right? You took it and you made a repetitive, handmade statement, if that makes sense. Is that correct? Is that a good evaluation?
Sure. Yeah. So I made it more particular, I think. And I also, I wanted to make it more specific, but I think that we're afraid as artists that if we make our work more specific, it will speak less.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, there's that universal and particular debate and sort of dichotomy that always is of interest to me. I'm a fan of the particular, and like you are, I think one of the things we tend to talk about way too much when it comes to like classical aesthetics is this idea of the universal. You know, everything needs to have this universal quality where everybody can get it, and that's a really lovely idea, or that it encompasses all truth or all ideas. And the truth is that universality is a little bit of a restriction of the local and the particular and the place and the individual and the complex, right? Universality tends to attenuate. So the Walmart reproduction that can be produced in a gajillion colors is really just the universal. To its grossest, is that a good, I always feel like that's its grossest version.
Yeah, I mean, you have more to say on this than I do, but I think that we don't need to be afraid of being particular.
Right.
Just because something has particulars doesn't mean that those particulars don't land for other people.
Right.
And I'm more interested in my work deeply moving a few people.
Yes.
And meaning something to them than washing over a lot of people where it doesn't particularly land for them.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have to be afraid of it not landing. I feel like, and this is maybe just me being a romantic, but I feel like if it's very deeply felt for me, then there's probably, I'm not that special. It's probably someone else that it can land for too. And I think that has happened with the work, and it's been affirming, but it was scary.
Yeah, it is kind of scary. Okay, so talk to us about the show, the name of the show, and where it comes from, and then we can talk about the film it comes from.
Okay.
What we have behind us here, like what does this come from?
Give me leave to do my utmost. So the short story, Babette's Feast, I can't even think. Babette's Feast by, you can tell me if I'm saying it right, Isak Dinesen.
I think so.
Babette is a chef, a very accomplished chef. And she says at the very end, and I'll let you explain this more because Erin knows so much more about this film. She teaches about the film. But at the end, she says, it's really, really difficult for an artist to be asked to do less than their very best. And here she had been a housemaid for years, and she recognized that she could day in and day out have been, if she was back in France, back in Paris, she could have been making these genius masterpieces for meals. And she says, she quotes one of her friends who says, give me leave to do my utmost. And one of the little, I can't remember what her name is, little ladies that she works for says, yet Babette, this is not the end. I believe this is not the end. This idea that, of course, all of us want to have all of our capacity, all of our concentration, to be able to make our best artwork, to be able to prove ourselves, but also just to have that flow, just to have that satisfaction of making our best work. And this lady that she works for says, this isn't the end. In heaven, you will be the great artist that God intended you to be.
Yes. So
you say some things because you know much more about the book and the film.
I mean, it's such a striking film visually, and it's funny. I just showed it to a group of college students who it won the Academy Award in like '87, so it's an old film. It's a film old to me, but it's old to them, right? They're like, "What is this?" And they told me, they said, "We thought that was going to be really dumb, and we really liked it," which made me really happy. In fact, the boys who were like the sports boys were like, "We loved that." I was like, "Oh, the sports boys!"
They wanted to see the turtle.
Right, they did. They wanted to see the scary turtle in the middle of the film. But the way the film, the way that you're talking about it, I think the way that you're talking about it in this work that struck me is that there's something that happened in your life where you felt like, what kind of work am I going to make now that I have children, right? I don't have the same kind of time to dedicate to the oil work, big canvases. I have to make a different choice. And I kind of read the title of your work, of the show, This Is Not the End, is that was not the end, right? I don't know if it felt like the end to you.
It did, yeah. Because I remember standing in my kitchen and just having a time where I just had to decide, like, will I completely surrender everything that my life is to God and just say, like, you can have it, I have no clue what's going to happen. Or, I mean, as if that made any difference in how my life would be, right? So it was just a big crisis point for me. And also, like, at the time, now there's all sorts of podcasts and books and support groups. At the time, I was looking for anyone that was talking about being a mother and an artist. I found a couple, they were mostly in literature because they had a big head start. A lot of them not incredibly encouraging, just kind of like, this is like where you are, but not kind of like, this is a way to, pursue it. So there weren't resources that I could find. And one of my friends said, if you've been looking for this for about 5 years, if you haven't found it, it's probably not there, you know what I mean? So I just kind of put my head down and did my thing. And I had, my own friends as a community, and that's what I needed. But I just wasn't sure whether I'd ever paint again. I have one piece that I've never shown. It's in my house, and I had, it was a paperback catalog that, like an auction house or like a gallery that's going to sell like a lot of, kind of go through a bunch of work. And it says Great Landscapes on the cover of the book, and I cut that book up and I collaged on top of it. So the book's there, and then an open children's book that has a butterfly, and it says, a butterfly is very, very small. And that was me.
That's how you felt.
Yeah, and I took green paint and I went over Great Landscapes. I mean, I thought it was done. Like, no more landscapes. So the fact that in this work, I'm putting the landscapes back into the mixed media pieces. So the pieces that I made before this body of work were mixed media textiles with no landscapes. And so these mostly have landscapes. So I'm self-consciously putting the pre-children work in with
back into the mixed media work.
Yes, because I did set aside the landscape. I didn't set aside the creative process. I did it in small ways. I used textiles, not on this scale. So this is not so much saying like, I'm back to paint these big landscapes, as these have always coexisted, and I'm not giving up. I'm also not willing to give up the domestic. I'm not willing to give up the care for my family. I'm not walking away from that now. I'm putting them together now that I can. So I'm keeping both of those. It doesn't mean I won't paint a straight up landscape, but it does mean I won't live a straight up artist life, because that's not going away. I'm not interested in that.
The other thing that strikes me about this particular quote from the movie and the film and the book, in the short story, is that Babette is saying, I think, she's saying, if you notice in that film, she never eats. She does not eat the meal she prepares. She makes it for the people, right? And then she says at the end, give me leave to do my utmost. It's not about you. This work is about me doing my utmost. Which I really think is very provocative. Like, for an artist to say, with all due respect to you, the viewer, this is not really for you. Which we're not very comfortable saying that, because that feels a little like in and out, But I think what she's saying is that the only way that I can be generous in my work is for me to enjoy the vocation I've been given to do work, right? Like, just give me leave to do my utmost. If you're here, that's great. If you want to come, that's great. But if you're not here, that's okay too. I'm going to keep doing it. There's a really avant-garde director / playwright named Richard Foreman, who very shockingly says, I don't do my theater for an audience. In fact, my theater can exist without an audience, which nobody in the theater says that. That's not a thing the theater people say. And he says, because I'm doing my work for an audience that is not here. There is a bigger audience somewhere, elsewhere, and he says, God perhaps? You know, and I don't know that he's religious. And he says, that's my audience, right? Well, what he's really saying is I'm doing the work because I can't stop doing the work.
Right.
I have to do the work. If I stop doing the work, I will stop being myself.
Yeah.
Which is sort of what I get from Babette. And I think whether you're saying it on purpose, you're sort of saying that, like, this is the work you want to do. And you're not doing it because somebody wants to buy it, i.e. that painting at Walmart or World Market, right? You're saying, this is the work I want to make, and I'm going to make it because I have to make it.
Yeah.
Because this is the work.
It should exist.
It has to exist.
Yeah, there's so much that we don't really have pinned down about audience, right?
Right.
Because we don't know where our work's going to go. We don't know who it's going to land with. You're making it for an audience, I guess, but you have to shut that out completely.
Yeah.
You have to say, this is the work I'm supposed to make, and it might not sell. I'm willing to adjunct to class. You know what I mean? Like, I'm willing to do some extra work in order to pay for my studio practice a lot of times. There's so much emphasis on sales follows fame right now, you know, because artists do want to be able to self-sustain. But there's an extent to which you have to be able to close the door and say, but what should exist in the world? Yeah. You know, what doesn't exist yet? What do I want to, and you know, if you read Isaiah 60, the kings of the earth are carrying objects into the New Jerusalem, to the new city. Am I willing to make something that maybe could be my best work, that could possibly, you know, if that's my goal, if you're thinking thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, what could be part of that picture? Yeah. So I don't think that it's going to be something that we don't care at all about. Right. Do you know what I mean? I think that we have to dig. And that doesn't mean that we don't make some fun pieces, and that we aren't somewhat careless with just as a fun. Yeah. But I do think that there needs to be a drilling down deep into what could be the best work that we could possibly make.
Well, something that you say, and another artist friend of ours talks about, is the heart pieces. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? I think that's really good, because you even mentioned it the other day.
Well, I was talking to her about some of my pieces, and she, you know, kind of like, we were actually working on my price list, and there are some of my pieces that take so long. They're just like, they're unbelievable in the amount of time. And she said, well, these are heart pieces, and you don't need to subsidize the price of these. If they connect with someone's heart, that person will get it, you know? Right. And I do think that there are some pieces here that are just weird, but they are they're straight from my heart. And there are people, those do deeply move people. They might not want to live with them, right? But they might, you don't know that. And those need to exist. Those actually are the pieces that give context to my more receivable pieces. Right. Do you know what I mean? Yes. Like, they're going to be the weird pieces that are so particular that will give the meaning to the pieces that seem a little bit less scary. Right. You know? Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, as a director, for me, you know, I'm working on a show right now that's all full of white wicker furniture, which feels very hard for me because I grew up in a bedroom with white wicker furniture, like many girls from the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah. And it feels a little weird, and I think it's an all-female cast of a Shakespeare show. Sometimes I think they think it's kind of strange, but it's from my heart. Yeah. And somebody asked me why the white wicker furniture, and I can come up with all kinds of really good sounding reasons. Yeah. But the answer is really, I don't know. I just love it. Yeah. Right? It's something in my heart says white wicker furniture that doesn't look like it was produced in the 80s, but looks like it was produced at the turn of the century with way too much proof on it that you could snap with your fingers. Yes, yes. There's something about that whole decorative, excessive, too muchness of all of it just feels like how my life feels sometimes. And I think that kind of work is always really special, because you're right, people don't always resonate with it, but there are people who do.
Yeah, and there's a lack of control. When you get away from minimalism, you've lost control. The more elements you have in any composition, the more elements you have in anything, the less control you have, but the more possibility you have. Yes. And I do have that kind of like overabundant chaos in my work, but also I don't have I cannot strip down my life very far.
Right.
I don't have a lot of control over it because we have a lot of moving parts and it's just the life I've been given.
Yeah.
So yeah, that shows up in my work.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts.
Okay, I feel like we were gonna do this for 10 minutes. And I feel like I don't know how many minutes we've done this, but it feels like this is part one.
So we're gonna take a break?
I feel like there's so many things we could talk about. Because even as you were just talking, I thought, wow, I have like 16 more things I want to talk about that I could ask Michelle about. But
do you have time? Should we just pause it? We'll come
yeah,
back?
let's pause.
Okay, we're gonna come back with another movie.